He came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of shadows, stretching long in the evening and disappearing at noon only to prove they were still there, attached and waiting. Jacob had learned that you could not outrun a shadow, but you could, perhaps, find a place so vast and quiet that the shadow's edges blurred into the landscape, becoming just another part of the terrain. He had chosen this corner of the national forest, a place stitched together with granite and pine, for its profound indifference. The mountains did not care about the man who walked their spine, nor the ghosts that walked with him. His boots, the leather worn to the color of dried blood and earth, made a steady, rhythmic crunch on the gravel of the fire road. It was the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the high branches and the near-silent panting of the dog at his side. Caleb, a German shepherd whose muzzle had gone from black to a distinguished silver gray, walked with the economy of a professional. He was not a pet. He was a partner. His amber eyes, intelligent and weary, were never still. They swept the tree line, checked the path ahead, and regularly glanced back at Jacob, a silent query of status and intent. Jacob wore his own kind of uniform, one he had assembled for this self-imposed exile. An olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 movements, covered a simple plaid flannel shirt. Cargo pants, practical and faded, were tucked into the tops of his boots. On his wrist, a military-issue watch, its face scratched but its mechanism faithful, ticked away a time that felt disconnected from the world he had left behind. His pack, an Eberly stock half-track, held everything he needed and nothing he did not. It was a life distilled to necessity, a discipline he clung to like a prayer. He stopped, and Caleb stopped a half-pace ahead, his head cocked, one ear swiveling back. Jacob did not need to give a command. The stillness was the command. He pulled a canteen from a side pouch on his pack, the metal cool against his palm. The water was cold and tasted of stone and distance. He scanned the valley below, a deep green bowl brimming with mist. This was to be their camp for the next few days, a place far enough from the road that the sound of a passing engine would be a forgotten language. He sought a silence so complete it had teeth, a quiet that could chew away the edges of his past. That past was a specific moment, replayed in the vulnerable hours before dawn. The heat, the metallic taste of fear in the air, the shouted order that was his own, and the silence that followed it. A silence far louder than the one he now sought. He had made a choice, mission over man. It was the correct choice by every metric of the creed he had lived by. It was the only choice, and it had cost him everything. The man he lost had been more than a teammate. He had been a brother, and Jacob had been the one to sign the order of his departure with a single, clipped command. So he had come here, to this quiet cathedral of rock and wood, to serve his penance in solitude. "What do you think, Cal?" he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on a particular cluster of aspens down the slope, their white trunks like bones in the fading light. Caleb's body was a study in subtle tension. His breathing had changed, the soft panting replaced by a slow, controlled intake of air through the nose. His tail, usually held in a relaxed curve, was now perfectly straight, a rigid barometer of his unease. Jacob's own senses heightened, a switch flipped by years of training. He followed the dog's line of sight. He saw nothing. Only trees, the gentle sway of ferns, the slow creep of evening shadows. But he did not doubt the dog. Caleb's instincts were finer instruments than his own eyes. The dog perceived the world in layers Jacob could not. A scent on the wind that was out of place, a sound beneath the threshold of human hearing, the simple, jarring wrongness of a thing. He screwed the cap back on his canteen, the scrape of metal on metal unnaturally loud. He slung it and moved forward, his steps now deliberate, losing their rhythmic crunch as he shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. He placed a hand on Caleb's back, a silent acknowledgement. The dog's muscles were coiled springs. They moved down the gentle slope together, a single unit of cautious purpose. The air grew cooler as they descended into the denser woods. The scent of pine and damp earth was thick, a familiar comfort that was now pricked with a needle of anxiety. Caleb led him not directly to the stand of aspens, but to a place just beyond it, where a patch of ground was unnaturally clear of the usual forest floor debris. Pine needles and leaves seemed to have been swept away from a small, circular area, exposing the dark, rich soil beneath. Caleb stopped, his nose hovering an inch from the ground. A low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound Jacob had not heard in years. It was not a growl of aggression, but of profound uncertainty. It was the sound a bomb dog makes when it has found something that smells like a threat, but is configured in a way it does not recognize. Jacob knelt, his knees sinking into the soft earth. He ran his gloved hand over the ground. It was cool, firm. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but as he looked closer, he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration in the soil. He pulled his folding knife from his pocket, the click of the blade locking into place a small, sharp sound in the immense quiet. He used the tip to gently scrape at the earth. A few inches down, the blade struck something with a dull clink. Not a rock. The sound was wrong. It was metallic. He widened the hole with his fingers, the soil cool and granular. His fingertips brushed against a cold, circular object. He worked it free from the earth's grip and pulled it out. He wiped the dirt away on the leg of his pants. In the palm of his glove sat a coin. It was heavy, larger than a quarter, its edges milled with precision. The metal was a strange, dull silver, almost pewter, and it did not reflect the dying light. On one side, an embossed image of a locomotive, old-fashioned and powerful, was encircled by a ring of mountains. On the other, a date, 1947, and below the date, a single word, Perditus. He had never seen a coin like it. It was not currency. It felt like a token, a marker. He looked at Caleb, who was now sitting, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed not on the coin, but on the ground from which it came. The dog knew. The coin was not the discovery. It was merely the key. Jacob stood up, the coin heavy in his hand, a cold piece of a story he did not understand. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, and the forest was sinking into a deep blue twilight. The silence he had sought was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. It held a secret, and his dog had just scratched the surface. The mountain was no longer indifferent. It was holding its breath. That night, his sleep was a shallow, restless sea. The camp was small and tight, his tent pitched with military precision under the dense canopy of a massive fir. Caleb lay at the entrance, a silent sentinel, but his rest was no deeper than Jacob's. The dog's ears twitched at every snap of a twig, every rustle of a nocturnal creature. Jacob found himself listening with him, his hand resting on the cold steel of the knife beside his sleeping bag. The coin sat on a flat rock next to his watch, its strange emblem seeming to absorb the faint starlight that filtered through the branches. Perditus. The Latin word echoed in his mind. Lost. Forsaken. It was a strange inscription for a token. It felt less like a name and more like a declaration, a final judgment on whatever this locomotive represented. He thought of the date, 1947. 2 years after the world had supposedly found its peace, a time of rebuilding and forward momentum. Yet here, in the heart of an untouched wilderness, was a marker that spoke of loss. Before the sun had fully risen, painting the eastern sky in shades of ash and rose, they were back at the site. The morning mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and shrouding the woods in a spectral gray. Caleb went directly to the spot, sniffing the perimeter of the cleared earth with a methodical intensity. Jacob watched him, trusting the dog's focus. A dog like Caleb did not fixate without reason. He was mapping a scent, defining a boundary. Jacob began to think like an operator again, a mindset he had tried to shed. He saw the terrain not as a landscape, but as a problem to be solved. The coin was the point of entry. The cleared ground was the anomaly. Caleb's behavior was the confirmation. He started walking a grid pattern, his eyes scanning the ground, looking for any other sign of disturbance, any deviation from the forest's natural, chaotic order. He found the second sign 20 yards to the north. A tree, an old-growth Douglas fir, bore a scar. It was not the clean chop of a woodsman's axe or the jagged tear of a lightning strike. It was a deep, horizontal gouge in the bark, about 4 feet from the ground, packed with ancient, hardened resin. Embedded within the resin, almost completely swallowed by the tree's slow healing, was a flake of metal, its surface pitted with rust, but still showing a trace of dark green paint. He scraped at it with his knife. It was steel. Thick. He looked from the gouge on the tree back towards the spot where he had found the coin. He drew an invisible line between the 2 points. It was a straight line. Too straight for nature. He walked the line, his eyes now scanning not just the ground, but the trees, the rocks, the very lay of the land. The third sign was the most subtle. A long, shallow depression in the earth, almost completely obscured by decades of fallen leaves and forest growth. It was a faint channel, perhaps 3 feet wide, running parallel to the line he was following. It was the kind of indentation left by something heavy that had settled into the earth over a great span of time. He followed it, his heart beginning to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The depression ran for nearly 60 feet before it terminated abruptly at a sheer rock face, a wall of granite that rose 100 feet into the air. It was a dead end, but it did not feel like an end. It felt like a destination. Caleb was already there, his nose pressed against a thick curtain of moss and ivy that clung to the base of the rock. He whined, a high, thin sound of frustration, and pawed at the dense greenery. Jacob joined him, pushing aside the heavy, damp vegetation. Behind it, the rock was not a solid wall. He saw a line, a perfectly straight, vertical line of shadow. His breath caught in his throat. He pushed more of the ivy away, his heart pounding. It was a seam, a man-made seam. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the cold, smooth edge of cut steel set flush against the carved rock. He had found a door. It took him the better part of an hour. The door was sealed not by a lock, but by time and nature. The edges were fused with rust and mineral deposits leached from the rock. He used the small, flat pry bar from his pack, working it into the seam with patient, consistent pressure. He worked in silence, the only sounds the grunts of his own exertion and the metallic scrape and groan of the seal slowly giving way. Caleb sat nearby, watching, a statue of focused anticipation. Finally, with a deep, shuddering screech that echoed unnervingly in the quiet woods, a section of the door gave way. It moved inward, opening into absolute darkness. A wave of air rolled out, cold and stagnant, carrying a scent unlike anything he had ever smelled. It was the smell of contained emptiness, of metal and oil and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, like decaying paper. He clicked on his flashlight, the powerful LED beam cutting a clean white tunnel into the black. The light fell upon a short, descending staircase of poured concrete. At the bottom was a steel floor, and beyond that, the long, narrow confines of what looked like a subterranean hallway. It was not a bunker in the military sense he knew. It was something else. The walls were curved. He took a deep breath, the cold, dead air filling his lungs. He gave Caleb a quiet command to stay. A low murmur the dog obeyed with a reluctant lowering of his haunches. Jacob descended the steps, his boots clanging on the metal, the sound shockingly loud. He swept the light from side to side. He was standing inside a rail car, a passenger car buried in the earth, its side fused to a custom-built entrance in the rock. The interior was a time capsule. Dust motes, thick as pollen, danced in the beam of his light. The seats were gone, stripped from the car. In their place, the floor was lined with wooden shelves, meticulously organized. The shelves were filled with metal boxes, canned goods with faded paper labels, and stacks of journals bound in simple leather. It was not a crash site. It was a refuge, a library, a tomb. He walked slowly down the central aisle, the beam of his light playing over the contents. The cans were stacked in neat pyramids: beans, peaches, corn. Emergency rations, but arranged with a sense of order that spoke of long-term habitation, not a frantic survival scenario. He picked up one of the metal boxes. It was a standard military-issue ammunition can, but it felt light. He unlatched the side. Inside, there were no bullets. There were dozens of spools of wire, delicate and thin. Recording wire. He moved further into the car, towards the back. Here, the space was different. A single wooden table and a chair stood bolted to the floor. On the table sat a piece of equipment he recognized from historical photos: a wire recorder, a bulky, archaic machine from the mid-20th century. Next to it was a single, leather-bound journal, lying open. His light fell on the page. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a woman's script written in faded black ink. The entry was dated October 12th, 1947. "The first snow has come to the high peaks," it read. "The sound of the wind is the only voice we hear now. Thorne's men are gone. The survey is complete. They believe we have left, that the valley is empty. They do not know we are still here. We are the valley now. We are its memory. We will not be moved." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the subterranean air. This was not a story of survival after an accident. This was a story of defiance. He looked around the silent, ordered space. This was a deliberate act. Someone had buried this rail car, stocked it, and stayed. They had hidden from the world in plain sight. He turned his attention back to the table. Beside the open journal lay a small, framed photograph, face down. He picked it up gently, his thumb wiping away a layer of fine dust. He turned it over. The photograph showed a family of 4, standing in front of a small, rustic cabin. A man, a woman, and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. They were smiling, squinting into the sun. Behind them, visible between the tall pines, was a valley floor, a river snaking through it. He recognized the sharp granite peaks in the background. It was the valley below him. But the valley in the photograph was different. It was alive with homesteads, fields, and the thin ribbon of a dirt road. Now it was just trees and mist. He heard a soft whine from the entrance. Caleb. The dog was reminding him of the world outside, of the passage of time his own watch still faithfully marked. He looked at the watch. Hours had passed. He felt a sudden, pressing sense of responsibility settle over him, as heavy as his pack. He had stumbled into someone else's story, a story that had been deliberately hidden, waiting for a voice. The silence of this place was not empty. It was filled with unspoken words, and he had just found the library. The name from the journal, Thorn, felt like a splinter in his mind. It was a common enough name, but in this context, it felt charged, sinister. Thorn's men are gone. Who was Thorn, and what survey had he been conducting in 1947? Jacob knew he couldn't find the answers here, in this buried archive. The story was here, but the context was out there, in the world he had tried to leave behind. He carefully closed the journal, leaving the photograph on the table. He backed out of the rail car, his light tracing his path, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. As he climbed the concrete steps back into the living world, the fresh, pine-scented air felt like a gasp after holding his breath. He pulled the heavy door shut, its groaning complaint echoing as it settled back into its frame. He did not have the means to lock it, but he carefully rearranged the ivy and moss, concealing the seam as best he could. It felt inadequate, like hiding a monument with a handkerchief. He stood for a long moment, looking at the rock face, then back at Caleb. The dog was watching him, his amber eyes seeming to hold a deep understanding. He had led Jacob here. He had known. Jacob felt the weight of the coin in his pocket. Perditus. Lost. But this place wasn't lost. It was hidden. It was waiting. The drive to the small town of Havenwood took 2 hours, a winding descent from the high country into the pastoral foothills. The town was little more than a main street, a cluster of buildings from the early 20th century huddled together as if for warmth. It had a gas station, a general store, a diner, and a 2-story brick building with faded gold lettering on its main window. Cascade County Clerk. Jacob parked his truck and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The transition from the profound solitude of the mountains to even this quiet outpost of civilization was jarring. People walked along the sidewalk. A bell chimed as someone entered the diner. These small, ordinary sounds felt alien. He felt a familiar urge to turn the truck around and retreat back into the silence, back to the clean, uncomplicated world of rock and sky. But the image of the family in the photograph and the elegant, determined script in the journal held him in his seat. He got out of the truck, leaving Caleb to watch the street from the passenger window with a look of stoic disapproval. The dog did not care for towns. Jacob pulled his field jacket tighter around him, a subconscious gesture of shielding himself. He walked into the county clerk's office. The inside smelled of old paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. A long wooden counter separated the public from rows of tall metal shelves, groaning under the weight of massive leather-bound ledgers. Behind the counter sat a woman. She was tall and spare, likely in her late 50s or early 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of reading glasses. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe but practical bun. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, assessing. This was the female authority figure from his past life, the gatekeeper of information, and he knew the protocol. Be direct, be polite, state your business. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. "I hope so," Jacob said, his own voice still feeling rusty. "I'm looking for old survey maps and property records from the 1940s. She took off her glasses, letting them hang from a chain around her neck. "That's a broad request. Which parcel?" "That's what I'm trying to determine. It would be in the High Valley, north of Bishop's Peak, an area that's now part of the National Forest." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Most of that land was acquired by the federal government in the late 40s and early 50s for the reservoir project." "The reservoir? There's no reservoir up there," Jacob stated, confused. "The dam was never built," she said, a flicker of something, old frustration perhaps, in her tone. They spent 5 years acquiring the land, relocating the families from the valley, and then the project was scrapped. Budget cuts, geological instability, depends on who you ask. The land was absorbed into the National Forest System in '53. Relocating the families. The word hung in the air. The woman in the journal had not sounded like someone who had been relocated. They believe we have left. We will not be moved. I'd like to see the acquisition maps, Jacob said, specifically for the land owned by a corporation associated with a man named Thorne. At the name Thorne, the clerk's posture changed. It was almost imperceptible, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. She looked at him more closely. Thorne Development was the primary contractor for the land acquisition, headed by a man named Alistair Thorne Sr. That was a long time ago. What's your interest? Historical research, Jacob said. It was the simplest, truest lie he could offer. She seemed to weigh his answer, her gaze drifting to the worn fabric of his jacket, the quiet discipline in his stance. She saw something that made her nod, a slow, deliberate motion. The acquisition maps are in the West Archive. So are the deeds. It'll take some digging. She stood up. My name is Evelyn Reed. And you are? Jacob. He offered nothing more, and she seemed to expect nothing more. She led him through a heavy door into a colder room, the air even more saturated with the scent of decaying paper. She pointed him to a section of shelves. The project was codenamed Odyssey. Look from maps and transfer deeds from 1946 to 1951. It's all organized by year. She paused, her hand resting on a dusty ledger. You'll find Thorne's name on nearly every document. He bought up the individual homesteads and then sold the entire parcel to the government in one block. Made a fortune. Jacob spent the next 3 hours hunched over a large table, carefully unrolling brittle maps and paging through dense, legalistic deeds. The story they told was one of efficiency and ruthlessness. Dozens of small family plots, homesteads with names like Miller, Garcia, Bennett, were all sold to Thorne Development in a flurry of transactions in late 1946. Then, in 1947, a single, massive deed transferred the entire valley, thousands of acres, to the United States government. But as he cross-referenced the names on the deeds with the map, he found an anomaly. One plot, right in the center of the valley, was different. It was a 160-acre parcel listed under the name Donovan. Michael and Eleanor Donovan. Unlike the others, the transfer deed for their property was not a simple sale. It was an eminent domain seizure, contested and pushed through with brutal speed. And the file contained a second, smaller map, a surveyor's map commissioned by Thorne. It marked the Donovan homestead with a red circle. Next to the circle, a handwritten note. Geological obstruction, unsuitable for habitation. Recommend immediate clearing. Donovan. The name struck him like a physical blow. Sergeant Thomas Donovan. The man he had lost. His best friend. Tommy had spoken of his grandparents, how they had lost their family land in the West somewhere, a story his father would never fully tell, a wound too deep to probe. He had always imagined it was a Dust Bowl story, a tale of economic hardship. He had never imagined this. He felt the air leave his lungs. The quiet room suddenly felt suffocating. The past was not a shadow he could outrun. It was a current, and it had just pulled him under. He needed an expert, someone who could see beyond the legal documents. Evelyn Reed, seeing the look on his face, made a suggestion. There's a man you should talk to, Dr. Alistair Finch. He's a retired historian and surveyor, lives just outside of town. He knows more about this county's bones than anyone alive. She wrote down an address on a slip of paper. Tell him I sent you. And, she added, her voice softer, be careful. Old stories have a way of stirring up new trouble. Dr. Alistair Finch lived in a small house overflowing with books and maps. He was a small, bird-like man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that lit up with a fierce, academic passion when Evelyn's name was mentioned. Jacob laid the copies of the maps and the Donovan deed on a large table already cluttered with historical charts.
Finch adjusted his spectacles and leaned over the documents, his finger tracing the lines with a practiced touch.
"Ah, the Odyssey Project," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "The Great Lie of Cascade County, a monumental boondoggle designed for one purpose, to enrich Alistair Thorne." "The dam was never real?" Jacob asked.
Oh, the plans were real. The geological surveys, the engineering proposals, all of it meticulously crafted. But Thorne himself, in his own private surveys, knew it would never be approved. The bedrock was too fractured. He knew the project would be scrapped. Finch tapped the map. But by then, he would already have his money. He used the phantom of the dam, the promise of federal dollars and the threat of eminent domain to bully these families into selling for pennies on the dollar. He bought their heritage for a song and sold it as a package deal for an opera. "What about the Donovans?" Jacob asked, his voice tight. "Their land was taken by eminent domain." Finch's expression soured. "Ah, the Donovans. They were the holdouts. Michael Donovan was a geologist himself. He knew the valley's bedrock was unstable. He knew the dam was a fiction. And he tried to tell everyone. He was a thorn in Thorne's side.
So Thorne had his own surveyor declare their homestead an obstruction and had them legally removed. It was a vicious but legal piece of work. "Removed to where?" Finch shrugged, a gesture of old sadness. "The official record says they left the state, but there were rumors, whispers that they never left the valley, that they simply vanished. People around here in those days learned not to ask too many questions about Alistair Thorne's business." Jacob's mind flashed to the buried rail car, the neat stacks of cans, the journal. "We will not be moved." They had not vanished. They had gone to ground. They had buried themselves in the heart of their own land, a final, silent act of protest. "There's something else," Jacob said, his hand going to his pocket and closing around the cold, heavy coin. He placed it on the table between them. Finch picked it up, his eyes widening.
He turned it over and over in his thin fingers. "My word," he breathed. "I've only ever read about these. This is a Perditus token." He looked up at Jacob, his academic curiosity now mingled with awe. "The rail line that used to run through these mountains, the old Silver Pine Express, had a tradition. When a car was decommissioned, taken out of service, it was declared Perditus, lost. They would mint a single token like this for the car. It was a symbolic gesture. This token belongs to a specific rail car. The locomotive on the coin, the buried rail car. It all snapped into place. The Donovans hadn't just found a random place to hide. Michael Donovan, knowing the rail line was being decommissioned, had somehow acquired one of its retired cars and buried it on his own land before Thorne could take it. It was an act of incredible foresight and defiance. "Dr. Finch," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "I think I found their car." The drive back up the mountain was different. The landscape was no longer a neutral sanctuary. It was Donovan land. Every tree, every rock felt like a testament to the family that had refused to leave it. The weight of responsibility on him had solidified, shifting from a vague sense of duty to a sharp, defined mission. He was no longer just a visitor. He was a witness. He returned to the hidden door with a new reverence. This time, when he entered the cold, still air of the rail car, It felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. He went straight to the table at the back. He needed to know the rest of the story. He spent hours there, in the silent, dusty dark, his flashlight beam his only companion. He read Eleanor Donovan's journals, one after another. She wrote of their life in the car, the challenges of their secret existence. She wrote of teaching her children, of the changing seasons filtering down through the hidden ventilation shafts, of her husband Michael's quiet, unshakable resolve. But mostly, she wrote about the wire recorder. Michael, a geologist and amateur audio enthusiast, had used the machine for a singular purpose. Before they went into hiding, he had spent weeks traveling and recording the sworn testimonies of the other families in the valley. He recorded their stories of being intimidated by Thorne's men, their accounts of the low-ball offers, their grief at losing their homes. He had gathered their voices, a chorus of the dispossessed. In the final journal, Eleanor described how they had sealed the recordings in a custom-built waterproof vault hidden beneath the floorboards of the rail car. Her last entry was dated 1958. She wrote that Michael had grown ill and that she feared their time was running out. Her final words were not a plea for discovery, but a statement of faith. We have kept the history of this valley safe. Its truth is here, rooted in the earth. One day, the mountain will speak. Jacob found the vault exactly where she had described it. It was a heavy steel box, its lid sealed with a rubber gasket. It took all his strength to pry it open. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were dozens of small, fragile spools of steel wire. Each was labeled with a name: Miller, Garcia, Bennett, and a date. It was a complete archive of Thorne's crime. And at the very bottom of the box was one last item: a folded piece of paper. Jacob unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in Michael Donovan's hand. It was addressed not to a specific person, but to whoever might find this place. It explained everything: the false survey, Thorne's deception, their decision to remain as silent witnesses. But it was the postscript that made Jacob's blood run cold. Alistair Thorne has a son, it read. He is learning his father's business. The name may change, the company may evolve, but the appetite will remain. If you read this, know that they will likely still be watching this land. They will not have forgotten what lies beneath. A sound from outside broke the spell. A sharp, urgent bark from Caleb. Not a warning of a bear or a mountain lion. This was different. It was the bark for a human. Jacob moved quickly, extinguishing his light and climbing the stairs. He peered through a tiny gap in the ivy-covered door. Down the slope, near his camp, stood a man. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in expensive hiking gear that looked brand new. He was tall, with a confident, easy posture. He was not a hiker. He was scanning the area, his eyes missing nothing. Behind him, a younger man in a work uniform stood respectfully. And parked on the old fire road, where Jacob had left his truck, were two new, black SUVs. Jacob's hand instinctively went to the knife in his pocket. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. They hadn't forgotten. The mountain was about to speak, and now, someone else had come to listen. The man walked with an unhurried, proprietary air, as if he were strolling through his own garden. He stopped near the spot where Jacob had pitched his tent, his gaze sweeping over the subtle signs of habitation. He was not looking for Jacob. He was assessing the intrusion. Jacob remained perfectly still behind the veil of ivy, his breathing slow and controlled. Caleb was silent now, crouched beside him, a low growl vibrating in his chest, too deep to be heard from a distance. The man turned to his younger companion. "Check the perimeter. Standard sweep. I want to know what he was looking for." His voice was calm, cultured, carrying easily in the still mountain air. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question.
The younger man nodded.
"Yes, Mr. Thorne."
Thorne. The name hit Jacob like a physical impact. This had to be the son, or perhaps the grandson of the man who had stolen this valley. The legacy of appetite, as Michael Donovan had written. He watched as the younger man began a methodical search of the area, his movements efficient, practiced. This was not a simple corporate team. They moved like security professionals. Jacob backed away from the door, retreating into the cool darkness of the rail car. His mind was racing, replaying the words in Donovan's letter. They will likely still be watching this land. How? For over 60 years? It seemed impossible, and yet, here they were. His discovery had tripped some silent alarm. Perhaps it was his truck, a new vehicle on a long dormant road. Perhaps it was something more sophisticated. It didn't matter. They were here. He looked at the open vault, the spools of wire holding the voices of the lost. He looked at the journals, the testament of a family's unbreakable will. This was not just a historical curiosity anymore. This was evidence. And the man outside was not here to appreciate history. He was here to erase it. A cold resolve settled over Jacob. He had stumbled into this, but now he was a part of it. His past had been defined by a choice that put a mission before a person. He had followed orders, followed protocol, and the result was a ghost that walked with him every day. This time, the mission and the people were one and the same. Protecting this place, protecting the Donovan story, felt like a chance to balance a scale that had been tipped for too long. He formulated a plan, simple and direct. He could not fight these men, not here, not now. He had to get the evidence out. The wire spools were small. He could fit a dozen of them in his pack. He would take the most important items, the journals, the letter, and as many of the recordings as he could carry. He would leave the rest and reseal the vault. He would hike out, avoiding the roads, and get the evidence to the only person he could trust, Evelyn Reed. He worked quickly and silently, his movements economical in the confined space. He selected the journals and Michael Donovan's letter first. He then began choosing wire spools, prioritizing the ones with the names he recognized from the contested deeds: Garcia, Bennett, and Donovan. He wrapped them carefully in a spare shirt and packed them deep inside his Everly stock. When he was done, he closed the heavy lid of the vault and pushed it back into its hiding place beneath the floorboards. He took one last look around the silent rail car, a place of profound sadness and incredible strength. He felt like he was leaving a promise. "I'll be back." He crept back to the entrance. Caleb was still there, a coiled spring of vigilance. Jacob peered out. The younger man was making his way up the slope, moving towards their position. Thorne stood waiting for him, his arms crossed, impatience in his stance. "Anything?" Thorne called out. "Tracks lead this way, sir, and the dog's trail is strong. They can't be far." Jacob knew he had only moments. The back of the rail car was flush against the mountain, but there had to be a ventilation shaft, something the Donovans had used for air. He remembered Eleanor's journal entry about the changing seasons. He moved to the rear of the car, running his hands along the curved ceiling in the dark. His fingers found it. A square metal grate, cold to the touch. It was stiff with rust. He used his knife to pry at the edges, the screech of the metal loud in the silence. He froze, listening. No reaction from outside. He worked faster, putting his shoulder into it. With a final groan, the grate gave way. A shaft of dim, green-filtered light fell into the car. It led upwards, a narrow chimney of earth and rock. He looked at Caleb. The shaft was too narrow, too steep for the dog. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. The choice. It was here, now, in a form he could never have anticipated.
leave his partner to save the mission. It was the same terrible calculus as before, the heat, the shouting, the friend he had ordered to hold a position that could not be held. Caleb looked up at him, then at the shaft of light, then back at Jacob. The dog whined, a low, questioning sound. He knew. He understood the choice Jacob was facing, and in his intelligent amber eyes there was no judgment, only trust. Jacob's hand trembled as he reached down to stroke the dog's head. The coarse fur, the solid warmth of him. Caleb had been his only anchor in the years of drifting. The dog had stayed with him when everyone else had, for good reason, kept their distance. Caleb was the one who had found this place. He was as much a part of this as Jacob was.
"No," Jacob whispered, the word a raw tear in the silence. "Not again." He closed his eyes, the memory of Tommy Donovan's face flashing behind them. He had made the right choice then, the choice of a soldier. Today he would make the choice of a man. He would not leave his partner behind. He would stay. He turned from the escape shaft and walked back to the main door. He took a deep breath, and then he pushed it open. The screech of the heavy door swinging outward was like a gunshot in the quiet forest. Jacob stepped out into the daylight, blinking against the sudden brightness. Caleb was at his side, his body low, a growl now audible, a clear and present warning. Thorn and his man spun around, startled. For a moment, no one moved. The younger man, Marcus, instinctively reached for his side, but Thorn held up a hand, stopping him. Thorn's expression was not one of anger, but of cool, detached curiosity. He looked from Jacob to the dark opening of the railcar, and a slow smile of understanding spread across his face. "Well, well," Thorn said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "The historian. I should have known. You've been busy." Jacob said nothing. He stood his ground, his hand resting lightly on Caleb's head, both a comfort and a command to hold. His posture was relaxed but ready, a lifetime of training holding him steady. Thorn took a few steps closer, his eyes appraising Jacob, the worn jacket, the determined set of his jaw. "You have no idea what you have stumbled into, my friend. This is a private matter, a piece of family history that we are tidying up." "I found the journals," Jacob said, his voice even, "and the recordings. I know what you're tidying up." Thorn's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Ah, then you understand that those materials are company property, misappropriated assets. I am here to reclaim them." He gestured vaguely towards the rail car. "Whatever you think you found, it is a footnote, a misunderstanding from a different era. Context is everything." "The context seems pretty clear," Jacob replied. "Theft, coercion, lies." "Business," Thorn corrected him smoothly. "The world is built on such business. Progress requires paving over the past. It's the natural order of things. Now, be a reasonable man. Give me the materials you have taken, and you can walk away from this. Go back to your quiet life. Forget you were ever here." It was a tempting offer. The escape route he had tried to build for himself offered up on a silver platter. He could take it. He could retreat back into his silence, his self-imposed exile. But he looked at the dark opening behind him, the sanctuary of the Donovan family. He thought of Tommy, of the debt he could never repay. This was not the same, but it was a chance to honor a promise, even one made to the dead. "No," Jacob said simply. Thorn's polite facade finally cracked. A flash of irritation crossed his face. "You are making a mistake, a significant one. You are a man who values his privacy, his solitude. I can assure you that privacy is a fragile thing. Your name, your service record. All of it can become very public, very quickly. And the narrative can be shaped. A troubled veteran, trespassing on private land, stealing valuable assets. It's not a story that ends well for you. It was a threat, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. A threat not of violence, but of exposure. Of twisting Jacob's own past into a weapon against him. Before Jacob could respond, a new element entered the standoff. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the peaks above them. The sky, which had been a clear, high blue, was now bruised with dark clouds rolling in from the west. A storm was coming. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to hiss through the pines. Thorn glanced at the sky, his annoyance deepening. "We're out of time. Marcus," he said, his voice sharp. "Secure the asset." Marcus, the younger man, hesitated. His eyes flickered from Thorn to Jacob. Jacob saw something in his gaze, a conflict. He noticed the man's posture, the way he held himself. He was a former soldier, Jacob was sure of it. He recognized the bearing. "Sir," Marcus began, "he's not armed. Maybe we should just—" "I gave you an order," Thorn snapped, his civility gone, replaced by raw authority. As Marcus took a reluctant step forward, Caleb acted. The dog moved with blinding speed, not at Marcus, but placing himself directly in front of Jacob, his teeth bared in a silent, lethal promise. It was a definitive statement. "You will not touch him." The standoff was absolute. Man and dog against the coming storm and the encroaching threat. The wind picked up, whipping leaves and dirt into the air. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. "This is your last chance," Thorn shouted over the rising wind. "Don't be a fool. This place is not worth your life." Jacob looked at the man who represented everything he had come to despise. Power without conscience, strength without honor. He thought of the family in the photograph and the quiet dignity in Eleanor Donovan's words. He looked down at Caleb, his loyal partner, who had chosen to stand with him without hesitation. "Some things are," Jacob said, his voice quiet but carrying over the wind. And in that moment, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. He had made his choice. He would not run. He would stay. The storm broke with the fury of a mountain squall. Rain came down in blinding horizontal sheets driven by a wind that tore at the trees. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion of sound that seemed to shake the very granite under their feet. In the chaos, Thorn's composure shattered completely. "Get the pack!" he screamed at Marcus, his voice thin against the gale. "Leave the man, just get the pack!" Marcus moved, not with the confidence of an attacker, but with the grim reluctance of a man following an order he hated. He lunged for Jacob, his arms outstretched, aiming for the Eberlestock pack that held the valley's history. Jacob sidestepped, using Marcus's momentum against him, turning him. But in the slick, muddy ground, his footing gave way. He stumbled, falling to one knee. In that instant of vulnerability, Marcus regained his balance and lunged again. Caleb intercepted him. The dog didn't bite, not with intent to maim. He hit Marcus in the chest with all his weight, a solid, driving impact designed to create space, to protect his handler. The move was perfect, tactical. But the ground was a treacherous soup of mud and wet leaves. As Caleb pushed off, his back legs slipped from under him. He yelped, a sharp cry of pain as his body twisted awkwardly, his right hind leg catching under him at a sickening angle. The dog went down, his cry cut short as he tried to struggle back to his feet, his injured leg dragging uselessly behind him. Time seemed to slow for Jacob. The roaring wind, the pounding rain, Thorn's shouts, it all faded into a dull hum. All he saw was his dog, injured, trying to get back into the fight to protect him. The memory hit him then, not as a hazy ghost, but as a vivid,
visceral flashback. The blinding sun of a foreign desert, the acrid smell of cordite, the shouting over the comms. Tommy Donovan, pinned down, calling for support, and Jacob, back at the Tactical Operations Center, looking at the map, at the overwhelming enemy numbers, at the mission objective miles away. He had made the call. "Hold your position, Tommy. We can't divert. Hold position." He had sacrificed his friend for the objective. He looked at Caleb, struggling in the mud. He looked at Marcus, momentarily stunned. He looked at the pack on his back, the mission, the objective. He could run. He was faster, more skilled in this terrain than either of them. He could escape with the recordings, complete the mission, deliver the Donovans justice. All he had to do was leave the dog. The choice was laid bare, stripped of all complexity. Mission or man, objective or partner. He did not hesitate. With a roar that came from a place of deep, primal rage, Jacob shrugged off the pack, letting it fall into the mud. He launched himself not at Marcus, but at Thorn. He moved with a brutal efficiency that his opponents were completely unprepared for. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a protector. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hand grabbing the front of Thorn's expensive jacket, twisting the material. He drove the man backward, slamming him against the hard, unyielding trunk of a massive pine tree. The air went out of Thorn in a shocked gasp. Jacob's face was inches from his eyes burning with a cold fire Thorn had only ever seen in his nightmares. "You don't touch my dog," Jacob snarled, the words a low growl of pure menace. Marcus, seeing his boss in peril, shook off his stupor and charged. Jacob saw him coming in his peripheral vision. Without releasing Thorn, he pivoted, his legs sweeping out, hooking Marcus's ankle. The younger man, already off balance on the slick ground, went down hard, his head hitting the soft earth with a dull thud. He lay still. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 seconds. Jacob turned his full attention back to Thorn, who was struggling for breath, his face pale with terror. The polished civility was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who had never faced real violence. "It's over," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. He released Thorn, who slid down the trunk of the tree to sit in a heap in the mud, gasping. Jacob ignored him. He turned and went to Caleb. He knelt in the mud, his hands gentle as he examined the dog's injured leg. It was broken. A clean break of the tibia, he suspected. Caleb whined, licking Jacob's hand, his body trembling with pain and adrenaline. "I know, buddy," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." He had made his choice. He had chosen his partner. He had stayed. And in doing so, he had, for the first time since that day in the desert, set down the weight of his past. He had failed Tommy Donovan. He would not fail Caleb. As he held his dog, the sound of the storm began to recede in his ears, replaced by a new sound. It was the crunch of tires on the wet gravel of the fire road. 2 sets of headlights cut through the gray, rainy gloom. A park ranger's truck and a county sheriff's vehicle were pulling up behind Thorn's SUVs. Out of the ranger's truck stepped Evelyn Reed, a grim, determined look on her face. She held a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting through the rain. Behind her, a uniformed sheriff's deputy stepped out, his hand resting on his sidearm. Thorn, seeing them, scrambled to his feet. "Thank God. Officer, this man assaulted me. He's a trespasser, a thief." Evelyn Reed's gaze swept the scene. Thorn, disheveled and mud-stained, Marcus, groaning as he started to sit up, and Jacob, kneeling in the mud, his arms around his injured dog. Her eyes finally rested on the Eberlestock pack lying nearby. She walked over and picked it up. She didn't open it. She just held it, then looked at Thorn, her expression like flint. "Alistair Thorn, Jr.,
she said, her voice cutting through the rain. "I have a warrant for your arrest and for the seizure of all materials related to the Odyssey Project reclamation." Thorne stared at her, dumbfounded. "A warrant? On what grounds?" From behind Jacob, a voice spoke. "On the grounds of conspiracy, fraud, and witness tampering." Jacob turned. Marcus was sitting up, his face pale but his eyes clear. He looked at Jacob, then at Thorne. "I made a call when we first got here," he said, his voice steady. "To the county clerk's office. I told her who we were and what we were here for." Marcus looked at Jacob, a deep, shared understanding in his eyes. He was a soldier who had been following the wrong orders for too long. Today, he had finally chosen the right one. "Some things are worth more than a paycheck, sir," he said. The "sir" directed not at Thorne, but at Jacob. The tide had turned, not by Jacob's strength, but by his choice.
His decision to stay, to protect his partner at the cost of the mission, had given Marcus the time and the moral clarity to act. It was an outcome he could never have planned, a quiet miracle born from an act of loyalty. The mountain had spoken, not in thunder, but in the choices of the men standing upon it. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet and clean. The air, scrubbed by the rain, was crisp and smelled of wet earth and pine. Sunlight streamed through the canopy in bright, hazy shafts, illuminating a scene of quiet, methodical work. The area around the railcar was cordoned off with yellow tape. A team from the State Historical Society, supervised by Evelyn Reed and a visibly ecstatic Dr. Finch, was carefully cataloging the contents of the buried car. Jacob sat on the tailgate of his truck, a thermos of hot coffee warming his hands. Beside him, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, lay Caleb. A local veterinarian had met them at the base of the mountain late last night, setting and splinting the dog's leg with practiced care. Caleb was sedated and sleeping, his breathing deep and even. His gray muzzle rested on Jacob's thigh, a familiar, comforting weight. Thorne and his primary team were gone, taken into federal custody. Marcus had given a full statement, corroborating the evidence in the journals and recordings and detailing Thorne's long-standing operation to monitor the land and suppress any discovery. It turned out the silent alarm Jacob had tripped was a simple motion-activated camera on the fire road, an electronic sentry guarding a 60-year-old secret. Jacob watched the proceedings with a sense of detachment. He had played his part. The story was now in the hands of others, people like Evelyn and Finch, who would ensure it was told correctly. The Donovan family and all the others would finally have their voices heard. A car crunched on the gravel behind him, a sound he would have tensed at a day ago. Now he just waited. A rental sedan, modest and unassuming, parked nearby. The driver's door opened and a woman got out. She was in her late 30s, with the same determined jawline and kind eyes he remembered from his childhood. His sister, Sarah. She walked towards him, her expression a mixture of worry, relief, and a deep, familiar sadness. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since he had first retreated from the world. Their calls had become infrequent, strained by the chasm of his grief. "Evelyn Reed called me," she said, her voice soft. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't pry. She just stood there, her presence a quiet offering. "I'm all right," he said. It was the first time he had said those words and felt they might actually be true. Sarah looked down at Caleb, her hand gently stroking the dog's sleeping head. "And your partner?" "He'll be fine," Jacob said. "He's tough." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a silence that was not empty but filled with years of unspoken understanding. The wall Jacob had built around himself had a door in it now, and she was standing right in the threshold. "Tommy would be proud of you, Jake. she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. What you did here. For his family. For your friend. She meant Caleb. Jacob looked away, towards the valley, where the mist was burning off, revealing the green, unspoiled floor below. He had not done it for Tommy, not really. He had done it for himself. He had done it to prove that he could be the man Tommy had always believed him to be. The man who stays. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook and a pen, something he always carried but rarely used. He opened it to a fresh page. For years, the only thing he had written was a single name, over and over. Thomas Donovan. A penance, a prayer, a reminder of his failure. Now, under the warmth of the morning sun, with his sister beside him and his loyal dog at his side, he wrote something new. He wrote down the names from the wire spools. Miller, Garcia, Bennett. He wrote down Michael and Eleanor Donovan. He was no longer just the keeper of a single ghost. He was now the steward of a history. Evelyn Reed walked over, her face tired but triumphant. The state is declaring the entire site a historical landmark, she said. It will be protected, permanently. She looked at Jacob, her sharp eyes softening. We could use a caretaker, someone to stay on the land, protect it, someone the mountain already knows. It wasn't a question. It was an offer of a new kind of purpose. Not an escape, but a reason to remain. Not solitude, but stewardship. Jacob looked at the sleeping dog, at his sister's hopeful face, at the valley that had been saved. He felt the weight of his old life, the field jacket, the military watch, the disciplined emptiness, begin to feel less like armor and more like a skin he could finally shed. I think, he said, the words feeling solid and real in his mouth. We'd like that. A month later, the first autumn colors began to touch the aspens, turning their leaves to coins of brilliant gold. Jacob stood on the porch of a small, rustic cabin that Park Services had helped him restore. It wasn't the original Donovan homestead, but it was close, built on a foundation of old stone with a view of the entire valley. Caleb lay on the porch beside him, his splinted leg propped on a pillow. The gray on his muzzle seemed a little more pronounced, but his eyes were bright and alert. He was watching a doe and her fawn graze peacefully in the meadow below, his tail giving a slow, contented thump against the wooden planks. The railcar had been sealed again, this time by professionals, turned into a permanent, protected time capsule. The story of the lost valley of Perditis, as the papers were calling it, had become a quiet legend, a testament to resilience and a warning about the rapaciousness of power. The Thorn Corporation was buried in lawsuits and federal investigations, its legacy dismantled by the voices on 60-year-old wires. Jacob no longer wore the olive field jacket. It hung on a peg inside the cabin door, a relic of a former life. He wore a simple denim shirt, its sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The military watch was gone, replaced by the simple act of watching the sun move across the sky. He felt the change not as a loss of discipline, but as a release into a different, deeper rhythm. He spent his days walking the land, not as a soldier on patrol, but as a guardian. He learned the names of the wildflowers, the tracks of the animals, the language of the wind in the different trees. He was no longer trying to outrun his memories. He was making new ones. He looked down at the coin he still carried in his pocket, the one that had started it all. Perditis. Lost. He thought of the Donovans, who had lost their home, but not their honor. He thought of Tommy, who had lost his life, but not his place in Jacob's heart. He thought of himself, a man who had been lost for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be found. He was not found, not in the way of a destination reached. It was something quieter. He had simply stopped running. He had chosen to stay, and in staying, he had found that the very ground beneath his feet could hold him. He had found a peace not in silence, but in listening to the stories the world wanted to tell.
Caleb nudged his hand, a wet nose and a soft whine. It was time for his medication. Jacob smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He knelt beside his partner, his friend, the one who had led him here. "Okay, buddy," he murmured, rubbing the dog's ears. "I'm here." The sun warmed his back. The valley stretched out before him, serene and safe. The mountain held its breath no longer. It was breathing with him. And for the first time in a decade, Jacob felt like he could breathe too. The silence was no longer a thing with teeth. It was just peace. An earned peace.